following this session from different places, including from São Paulo and Brasilia, that I know there are people that went online to follow this discussion. The Wilson Center is a public policy research institute that honors the memory of the 28th President of the United States. And Woodrow Wilson, who is the only American president to come from the academic world, used to say that those who govern benefit from those who study government, and they should be closer together. And the idea of the Wilson Center comes from that. We have about 2 hours of webcast, so I will try to run this in a way that we close just before 4 p.m. The subject of land use and biofuels is at the center of the discussions on food price increases and food supply right now. Very prominent discussion. I am just back from Brazil, where I noticed there is a hard to disguise frustration with the way Brazilian biofuels production is being portrayed in that discussion. Some people, if you talk to them, people from this field will remind you that no man may be created equal, biofuels are not. They are created very differently depending on where they are produced, what the climate of the countries, what types of plants are used, and so actually there is I sensed a certain conspiracy theory developing about this, this effort, what appears sometimes from Brazil to be an effort to mix things and to not clarify what are the different types of biofuels and what are the different methodologies for production, the different incentives, etc. To discuss this issue today, we have 3 excellent people. We have André Nassar, he is the president, Director General of ICONI, which is a research institute in São Paulo. André has been an advisor to agricultural negotiations at the Doha round, acting on behalf of the Brazilian government in that capacity, and he is a leading expert on this issue. We have also Todd Johnson, the energy specialist on at the Sustainable Development Department, Latin American and Caribbean region for the World Bank. And Todd has also worked extensively on this and issues associated with this, like climate change. Bramble, dear friend, Senior Program Advisor for International Affairs at the National Wildlife Federation, who has also been working on Brazilian issues and on this in particular for a number of years. I will start the way we planned this is to give André up to half hour to make your presentation, but you don't need to use half hour. You could save some, and then give Todd and Barbara about 15 minutes, and then open for discussion. So, André, you're welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a great opportunity for us because that's the first time that I will present some very new numbers that we are producing in Brazil. And of course they will be changing in the future because this is an ongoing project. But anyway, I think it's a good opportunity to share the numbers and see if we have similar thoughts about that. And also I think it's important to understand the whole of Brazil on the agricultural supply given these very high prices. So I think Brazil has a central role on that. So the idea here is discuss land use in Brazil and try to focus on sugarcane ethanol. That's the main objective of the presentation. And I think that I'm going to start the presentation discussing why the issue of land use is so important now. I think we can find other topics for that, but I think that those four are the most important. One is that as we realize that oil is a scarce resource, we are realizing also that land is a scarce resource also. Of course, in some countries, this is the reality now, and in other countries, we have to have a long-run perspective. Just to give you a first number on that, we calculated that, I will show the table later, we calculated that Brazil has in the savannas region something around 35 to 40 million hectares of land, right? Even the most optimistic projections for the next 10 years Brazil will be using no more than 15 million hectares plus than now. So even if we have 35 million hectares, we will not be using the whole amount of land that we have on the next 10 to 15 years. So I would say that long run is something like more than 20 years, right? So I think that land will be a scarce resource for Brazil from now to 20 years or more than that. So I think it's important to have this on perspective, right? On this, the second reason I think is the competition between food and fuel. It is clear that is not a problem in Brazil, but it's clear that is a problem that this is a problem in other countries like US, European Union, and also in China and also in India. I don't have numbers on China and India here, but we are monitoring a lot land use in China and India. And India has no more than 10 million hectares available for agriculture in a very dry and sand land, so it's not so easy to convert them for agriculture. But anyway, Indian agriculture has a very low productivity, so they can increase production, increasing productivity. But of course, they need to find out how to deal with the migration problem, because it's almost impossible to increase productivity in India with an average landhold size of 1 hectare. So you need to increase that. It's almost impossible to increase productivity with very small plots as they have in India. In China they are doing that, but in China is a different situation because China is moving to high value added products, and wheat, corn, and soybean oilseeds area have been reducing in China. That's why they are importing more and more grains from Brazil and US and other countries. The second thing that is important is because in a situation like we are seeing now with very high prices of agricultural products, only countries with land available will respond to that increase in production, right? So even if United States increase, for example, this year soybean area is going up and corn area is going down, so you are exchanging land. What in European Union is the same situation, but in Brazil is different. So we can increase food production and biofuel production at the same time. This competition of food and fuel, for me, will completely change the allocation of agriculture, of production supply in the world, right? So countries that are very important supplying agricultural commodities to the world will be less important in the future, and others will be more important. And Brazil is one of the candidates to be more important in the future. Argentina should be also, but they have this crazy policy of imposing taxes on exports. And this is crazy for me, because if you have high world price, it doesn't matter to try to control your domestic price, holding the production in the domestic market, because as soon as they increase the export taxes, world prices go up also, and then negative affect the domestic market. So it's a vicious circles that they don't have any escape for that. So the best thing to do is to eliminate these export taxes. But Thailand is doing the same thing. Egypt is doing the same thing. So this is affecting a lot rice price. And increasing importance of trade. It is clear that many countries, like Middle East countries and net food import countries, they are not. They depend on world market, and for them the best thing to do is to increase domestic production, at least now with this situation of very high prices. But trade is very important now. If we, for example, if we would have ethanol trade, free trade on ethanol, maybe corn price would not be so high as they are now. So this is, I think we need to bear in mind that. The third issue is the implications for avoided greenhouse gases emissions. Why is that? One is the question of direct effect. So the idea is that if energy crops, area for energy crops is increasing, energy crops would be displacing, would be pushing other crops to natural landscapes and then contributing to deforestation or things like that. Oh, this is the indirect effect. Sorry, the direct effect is the idea that sugarcane, for example, the place where we are growing sugarcane is very important to measure the balance of carbon. Why is that? Because if you are replacing pasture land and soybean land and corn land, sugarcane will have a positive effect on carbon cycle. But of course, if Brazil decides to plant sugarcane, the Amazon, for example, this is almost impossible, but anyway, that's the worst scenario, right? Then the carbon cycle, sugarcane would have a deficit in terms of carbon cycle due to the deforestation. So this is a major objective for us, is to show that sugarcane is growing in pasture and grain areas, and I have very nice numbers, very good numbers on that. The second thing related to the avoided greenhouse emissions is the unbalanced discussion, because countries with natural landscapes are in a worse situation than countries that have no landscapes anymore, right? Because if you deforestate your natural landscape on the last 50 years, this doesn't matter for carbon emission now. But this is very important for countries that are changing the landscapes. And the last topic, which is very complicated, is the indirect effect. I don't know how to deal with. I don't know how to model this. This is very complicated. So I just have a one table to show to you how complicated is this and how biased is the discussion on saying that, okay, corn is, United States is producing more corn, this is pushing up corn, and then Brazil will produce more corn to compensate United States, and doing that Brazil will deforestate the Amazon, and this is the indirect effect of the corn ethanol production in the United States. So it's, even if we have no numbers, it's complicated to agree that this is something that we can take as a serious argument. But anyway, I think we can discuss on that. Direct effect is something different. I think it's technical defensible, but indirect effect is complicated to defend. All right, that's our strategy on agricultural land use. So we have 3-step strategy. One is to estimate the land availability for agriculture in Brazil. So I'm going to show some numbers on that. The second is to project expansion of crops in Brazil and cattle production, because this will show us how much land we are going to need in the future, right? And we will compare that with the amount of land that we have, right? So that's why we decide to calculate land availability first, and after that we start to project agricultural expansion. In the first step, we are working in a World Bank study. On the second step, we are working with U.S. institute in Iowa State University. And the third step, the idea is to calculate the spatial reallocation of crops. So the idea is that sugarcane will grow, soybean will grow, corn will grow. Where in the country those commodities, those crops will grow, right? Because this is very important for the people that are calculating carbon emission, because doing that we can see which crop will displace other crops. That's the main idea. And also if we will need new land for that. So if we will need to incorporate or not new land, look into the projections, right? That's the main idea. So we calculate the land availability. I'm gonna show numbers for you. And the second and the third step, we are a little bit far from them, but anyway, we are working on that. And that issue is the priority for ICONI. So our private sector is interested on that. Our sponsors are interested on that. So we are 100% of our time working on that. Okay, I just put this graph here because I need to say some words about cattle in Brazil, right? The 2006 data are the preliminary data from the agricultural census of 2006, right? As you can see, we are not we don't do census very much. We should be doing more, right? So, but the 2006 will be after 10 years will be the new census. I don't trust very much on the 77 million hectares on crops. This is a preliminary data, and this will be around 65 million hectares. Will be less than that. But anyway, I think what is important is to look to the pasture, to amount of land allocated to pasture. We have 172 million hectares on pastures. I know that in US you work more on. You are more familiar with acres. You just multiply by 2.4. Is not so difficult to have a better idea, to have a good idea of the numbers, right? So what is happening in Brazil in cattle now is very important. So you can see that pasture land is more or less stable during the time, right? It's oscillating a little bit, but it's more or less stable, right? What is going to happen in the future is that cattle production in Brazil, cattle supply now is very, very tight due to the very low prices that we saw on the last 3 or 4 years. Ranchers start, this is a little bit technical, but it's important to understand because this has an implication in terms of land use on pasture. Ranchers start to sell cows and calves, right? And now prices of cows and calves are very high in Brazil, and this means that it's almost impossible that on the last 5 to 7 years that our cattle herd will go up. So our cattle herd will decrease, or at minimum will be stable on the next 10 years at least, right? 10 years, no, 7 to 8 years. This means that there is no economic reason for any expansion in terms of pasture land in Brazil. Because if our cattle herd is stable, we don't need to incorporate more land for pasture. Actually, is exactly the opposite, because our cattle production has a very low productivity. So given that our cattle herd will be stable and we need to increase the production of meat because world is demanding more meat, in order to do that, we need to increase the productivity. The way to do that is to putting more animals in less land. So it is clear that pasture land will be lower than 172 on the next years. We did some calculations and we reach something like 150 million hectares. So pasture will release 20 million hectares only for economic reasons. It's not pressure coming from crops, right? It's just an economic cycle of cattle production in Brazil. And I think that's the best figure, because we don't need to incorporate more land if we will have 20 million hectares coming from pasture, and if we will need around 15 million hectares in the next 10 years, we don't need to incorporate new land to increase our agricultural production, right? So that kind of figure, I think it is very important. The green column is the amount of forest in the farm, right? Because you need to keep protected part of your farm. We will see the numbers later, but you see that is increasing also, which is interesting. But it's following the trends also, right? Okay, so this is the Brazilian map. So we couldn't talk here about land use here without looking to the Brazilian map, right? So I think it's necessary to do that. But that's an interesting map, because that's the map that is showing the different biomes that we have in Brazil, right? The green, the strong green is the Amazonia. Sorry, I don't have in English, but Amazonia is the Amazon, right? The light green is the Atlantic forest, right? We find Atlantic forest in the Brazilian coast. The blue one is the Cerrado. Cerrado is the Brazilian savanna. That's the most important agricultural region in Brazil. That's where the agricultural production will increase in the future. So Cerrado is very important in terms of agricultural production. It is now and will be even more important in the future. The light blue, is Caatinga. Caatinga is a very dry region, so we will find only mutton and some cows there. We have fruits, of course, there, but it is fully irrigated, right? So the light green is not an agricultural area, if we would say that. And blue. And the strongest blue in the south, in RS is the letters, the initials are the name of the states. In RS is the humid area. It's a drought. How we call this? We have water in the summer, and then we plant rice, right? And we have rice there because we can irrigate. We can use the water from the rivers in the summer mainly, right? So one thing that is important is to understand that if you are in the Atlantic forest, or if you are in some parts of the Cerrados, you need to keep preserved 20% of your farm. That's the legal reserve, right? If you are in a Cerrados that is inside the legal Amazon is a complicated concept, but anyway, we can talk about that later. It's not the Amazon, but is inside a legal region, inside a region that is legally defined as legal Amazon. So you need to keep preserved 35% of your farm, And if you are in the Amazon, you need to keep preserved 80% of your farm, right? So I will not show any numbers regarding Amazon because you need to keep preserved 80% of your farm, and crop production is pretty small in the Amazon, at least until now. So the real agricultural frontier in Brazil is the Cerrados, is the Mato Grosso state, Tocantins states, MA state, which is Maranhão, and we will see numbers about that later, right? Any numbers that I will show here have as an assumption the amount of land that have to be preserved, right? That's the legal scenario. Okay, this is difficult to see all numbers, but anyway, what I want to show to you is that take a look on sugarcane, which is the third graph in the bottom line, right? You can see that sugarcane is concentrated in. You have a laser point, something like this. No, I think I can use the mouse. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So you can see that sugarcane is concentrated here in São Paulo, concentrated here in MG. Yeah, okay, don't worry. Sorry. In São Paulo is here in the north of Paraná. So the traditional area of sugarcane is here. The new area of sugarcane is here, here, and here. Right? That's where sugarcane is expanding in Brazil. We have one another mill here or here, but they are one or two. It's very small, right? It is not important in terms of production. So production is concentrated here and is moving to here, here, and here, right? So the idea is moving is what crops sugarcane is displacing. That I think that is important, right? And if you look to the soybean map, you see that we have soybean here, we have soybean here, we have soybean here also. If we look to corn, we can see that corn is the same thing. We have corn in all this region. So sugar, and if you look to cattle, you can see that we have cattle all over the country, right? So that's what we are trying to measure, right? Okay, so just to give you some numbers, harvested area of sugarcane this is 2007 numbers, but for 2008 we will harvest 6.9 million hectares of sugarcane, right? Is the record, right? And if we look to the grain area in Brazil, for 2008, Brazil will reach 140 million hectares, right? So we are comparing 7 million hectares of sugarcane with 140 million hectares of grains. So this is 20 times lower, right? Right, 20 times lower. So one thing that I think that is very important for everyone to know is that sugarcane is land dedicated to sugarcane is very small compared to any other grain or oil seeds or cereals production. This is very important, right? Right. Oh, no. I made some confusion here. This is production, sorry. And in terms of planted area, we have around 40, we will have in this year 45 million hectares of for grains and 7 million hectares for sugarcane, right? So we have around 5 times lower, right? What else? This is, for example, the evolution of harvested area. So you can see that corn is starting to grow again, soybean is going down, but this is 2007, but it's going up again, and sugarcane is here. So we are comparing 6 to 22 with soybeans and 6 with 14 million with corn, right? and with rice we have around 4 million. This is just to give you some numbers, then you can bear in your mind how much land we have for the different crops here. And of course, don't forget the 172 million hectares for pasture. All right, this is productivity, just to show that productivity is going up for all crops in Brazil, including sugarcane. This is cotton. Cotton is increasing very fast, but the basis was very low, right? So it's just to show that productivity is going up very fast. Okay, comparing Brazilian area with crops with United States area with crops. So we have around 45 million hectares in Brazil, and US around 95 million hectares. So US is almost double of Brazil. What is interesting here is the number inside the parentheses, because we can see here the annual growth rate. So we see that corn annual growth rate is positive, and soybean is negative, wheat is negative, cotton is negative, and rice is negative. So it's clear that when it is land, the amount of land is something that will not be increased in the future in the United States. This is different in Brazil. If we look to Brazil, we can see that Brazil is expanding in terms of planted area. And we have positive annual growth rates for all crops. Sugarcane, 5, 6 for soybean, 7.1 for second crop of corn. This is important also because our corn production is a second crop. So we plant soybean first or cotton, and during the same summer we plant corn, and we have a second crop of corn. So the first crop of corn is more or less the same in terms of area harvested, but the second crop is increasing very fast. Only rice, the planted area is decreasing, but in rice production is increasing very fast because productivity in rice is going up very fast, and also we used to have rice spread over the country, and now rice is becoming more concentrated in the south, which is a very competitive region. So the south region is rice production. South region is specialized in rice production. So we don't need to increase harvested area there. We just need to increase productivity. Okay, this is the comparison of Brazil with European Union. So in European Union we have around 60 million hectares, and numbers are also interesting. We can see rapeseed annual growth rate is positive, but in rye, sunflower, barley, and wheat and corn is negative. So rapeseed for biofuel, for biodiesel in European Union is displacing food. Right? In European Union it's clear, right? And in Brazil it's totally different. So I think this is very important because the question of competition between food and fuel is true in European Union, is true in the United States, but is not true in Brazil, right? Okay, that's just the final figure on that. So this is the absolute variation from 2000, 2002 to 2006, 2008. Just to show to you that in Brazil, sugarcane, soybean, corn, even cotton are going up. Total is going up also. And United States, only cotton is going up, and cotton, rice, soybean, and wheat are going down. In European Union, only rapeseed is going up, and other crops are going down, right? Okay, that's the very new number. I'm starting to trust on this number, but anyway, on the numbers. And the idea here is that we decide to work on a municipality level, so we calculate land availability in each city in Brazil, right? What I'm showing here is just the Cerrados region, right? And I'm showing here only the area where sugarcane is expanding. So this is not for the whole Brazil. Why is that? Because, for example, I will come back very fast to the first graph. For example, if you look here, This is Bahia. Bahia is a big state, right? This is Cerrado, this is Caatinga, this is Atlantic Forest. We have mountains here, so you cannot put agriculture on here. Here is very dry, so we cannot use for agriculture for crops, right? We can use for fruits, but not for crops. And the only region in Bahia that is suitable for agriculture is here. The same for Piauí, the same for Minas Gerais. For example, only 55% of Minas Gerais can be used for agriculture. The other 45 cannot be used because we can use for coffee, for example, but coffee is in the mountains, right? Coffee is not competing with crops, right? That's why I decide to calculate the land availability only on regions that are suitable for agriculture. That's the idea, right? So what we can see here is, this is the planted area. This is for 2006, right? We have, in this region, we have 4.9 million hectares for sugarcane on 6.1 total in Brazil, right? So it's just to give you an idea of the size of this region that I'm working, okay? For grains, we have 36 million hectares for Brazil and 25.7 in this region. Total crops, we have 41 in this region and 62 in Brazil. Pasture land, we have 172 million hectares in Brazil and 75 million hectares in this region, right? This region has 116 million hectares suitable for agriculture, right? Sorry, this is total. This is the sum. I'm summing this and this. So we have 116 million hectares used for agriculture, and 150 million hectares available for agriculture. This minus this, we have 35.9 million hectares, right? So in this region, we have around 36 million hectares that can be used for agriculture, right? And I'm not counting here the amount of land that pasture will release in the future, right? So this is legal reserve here. Then you can have an idea that I'm counting this also, right? So this is Cerrados, mainly Cerrados, because in São Paulo and Paraná we don't have land available anymore, right? Okay, this is the calculation of sugarcane expansion substituting other crops. That's the idea, right? So in São Paulo we had in 2002 2.6 million hectares used for sugarcane. In 2006 we had 3.2 million hectares. So the absolute variation was 623,000 hectares. Okay, so where sugarcane grew, where, right? The majority was on pasture land and just a small part was in crops, right? This is very important because sugarcane is displacing pasture in São Paulo, in Minas Gerais, in Paraná, in Mato Grosso do Sul, in Goiás. Mato Grosso is more or less balanced, right? So we have sugarcane is the donor of land. Pasture is the donor of land for sugarcane. And for carbon cycle, this is very important because sugarcane is much more efficient in terms of avoided carbon emission than pasture, right? One thing that is important is when we sum this with this, we reach a number that is higher than this. This is why, because in some cities, in some municipalities, we saw a reduction on sugarcane area also, right? So I'm just counting here cities where sugarcane expanded. That's the idea, right? So pasture is, sugarcane is growing on pasture. Definitely sugarcane is growing on pasture. Okay, why I'm showing this? Because of this paper made by Dave Tillman, and what he did here is that he measured the deficit of carbon emission on sugarcane if sugarcane displaced wooded cerrado, right? So what I'm showing is that sugarcane is not displacing cerrado, is displacing pasture, right? So this calculation is theoretical only. It's not true, right? This is not happening in Brazil. That's the first thing. For those of you that are not familiar with this, 70 is 17 years. So if you replace wooded cerrado with sugarcane, we need 17 years with sugarcane there to recover the amount of carbon that you emitted when you deforested the wooded cerrado, right? Okay. So, but you could ask me, okay, Andre, but is sugarcane expanded in cerrado or not? Maybe, right? Maybe. We don't know exactly how much, but maybe. Okay, let's try to see this. One thing that is important. This is the cerrado region. This is a characterization of the cerrado region. Wooded cerrado is what we call cerrado forest vegetation, right? But if you look, for example, for Minas Gerais, we have, this is the remaining natural cerrado. This is the anthropic vegetation, which is vegetation that is used by human activities, agriculture and other activities, right? And this is how this remaining vegetation is divided in different types of vegetation, right? So you can see here that what predominates in cerrado is the savanna vegetation. It's not the wooded cerrado, which is equivalent to this. And agricultural expansion, it is happening here. It's not happening in the forest vegetation. Why is that? Because forest vegetation, for example, Mato Grosso, we have 7.7 million hectares of forest vegetation in cerrado, wooded cerrado, right? Where is this? This is here, in the border, right? In the border of the Cerrado and Amazon. And sugarcane is growing here, right? It's not growing here. So this is very important for you to know. When we say that sugarcane is displacing wooded cerrado, this is almost impossible because the majority of cerrado is not wooded. And second, agriculture is not growing on wooded cerrado, but in savanna vegetation, which capturate much less carbon than wooded cerrado. Just a final. I think that's the final. Okay. I don't know how to measure the indirect effect, so I just decide to make a very simple calculation here, right? This is the absolute variation of planted area from 2006 to 2002, the same number that I showed here, right? 623,000 hectares, 623,000 hectares here, right? I just calculate the net area compared to 2006 and 2002 devoted to sugarcane, pasture, and crops. This is very interesting because sugarcane and crops in São Paulo, crops without sugarcane, it's crops minus sugarcane. That's the idea. It is in the footnote here. So we can see that pasture has released more land than the expansion of sugarcane and crops. So it's very difficult to make any argument of indirect effect in this situation, right? We could make an indirect effect argument, for example, here in Goiás, because we have 33.8 thousand hectares plus more in sugarcane, but we have pasture expanded also and crops expanded also. So we could say that, okay, 33.8 thousand hectares of sugarcane is pushing up, is displacing this, maybe, but it's quite difficult to make this argument because we have grains growing at the same time that sugarcane is growing also. So it's very difficult to say that when sugarcane is growing, is changing, is leading other crops to other regions, because agriculture is expanding. Agriculture production is expanding in all crops in Brazil, right? So I think that this argument of indirect effect, it's very difficult to make. I don't know how to say that it is wrong, but for sure it is not right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, André. I would ask Todd to go next. Yes.
Thank you. Well, let me tell you, I was talking with a senator, a state senator actually yesterday from Massachusetts, and he said, well, you know, in Brazil they're cutting down all the forest and they're planting sugarcane. And I said, well, actually that's not really true. But there is that perception in the U.S. and I think it is very important to lay out what's true and what's not, and because everybody gets very emotional especially about the Amazon, etc. So anyway, it's very important to separate this fact from the fiction. We've been working in the World Bank on biofuels for a number of years. We actually did a study about 3 years ago where we looked at biofuels production globally, and obviously Brazil was one of the main countries that we looked at. And when we did the study, we took time. It was very analytical, and we looked at the costs, and we looked at a lot of the issues. And various groups in Brazil came to us because they thought we were being much too pessimistic, and so our initial report was about 80 pages, and they sent us a 100-page report, commentary on our report. But it was obviously very important to them. Interestingly, about in the last year, when a lot of the reaction, I guess, to food policy and higher prices have come up, the same groups kind of come out and they go, well, at least you should look at the World Bank. They're analytic, and they've done it. They've done their homework, and they've been analytic about it. So in some ways, I think at the beginning our work was probably more cautious than a lot of other people were, and I think now we probably sit a little bit more in the middle. But I think Andre is absolutely right. It's very important to look at where biofuels are grown, and from our perspective, we're looking not just at ethanol from sugarcane and other crops, but also biodiesel. And it's also very critical for Brazil to do detailed analysis of expansion of crops and where those would go and what are they displacing. And that's not an easy exercise. And we've been doing it most recently, looking at biodiesel and looking at production of different biodiesel crops: soy, palm, cotton, etc. in Brazil, and the same thing. In fact, we've been working with the University of Sao Paulo on a model that they have, and actually we've been working with Iowa folks as well, looking at what displaces what and actually the economics of it. Let me make a couple points here in response to Andre's presentation. I think it's clear that Brazil in the future is probably poised to be the breadbasket of the world. I mean, no country that I know of has the availability of land that's with good climate, that's rain-fed, and so in some ways Brazil is sitting very nicely from an agricultural production perspective to supply a lot of the world's food. And I know many countries are very interested in Brazil from that perspective. Many countries are investing right now in cropland in Brazil, etc. And in some ways, a lot of it may be related to sugarcane production, etc. But a lot of it more, I think, is the land. And to have land like Brazil that again has such a favorable climate, where there is a lot of available land, including in the Cerrado, and again, there's a huge amount of land in the Cerrado that's potentially available for agricultural production. In some ways, a lot of the biofuels is important because if it is displacing land that is in agricultural production, it's obviously that less land in production for food, and to me that really is the issue. And I would say that actually even for Brazil, there is a, maybe not a direct but certainly an indirect argument of of the importance of Brazil for food as well, because Brazil, for many crops, Brazil is a major world exporter. Certainly for soybeans, for sugar, I don't know what the numbers are exactly right now, but Brazil is, I think, still the largest sugar provider in the world. So to the extent that land is being used for crops other than sugar, in this case it is sugar, but it's whether you make it into sugar or whether you make it into ethanol. So the more of it, and again there's flexibility, just for those who don't know, that when they build these plants, these joint plants that can produce a range of, say, between 40% sugar and 60% sugar, with the balance being ethanol, there is that range. So you can make a decision within that range of how much, of whether you're producing additional sugar or whether you're producing ethanol. And from a farmer's perspective in Brazil, they can arbitrage, and they can, just like a corn farmer in the U.S. can arbitrage, and look at what's the highest value for this grain. Is it for sugar? Is it for ethanol? And so in some ways, those are the pushing and pulling elements that are going to determine whether that farmer produces 40% or the 60%. And what happens if they produce 60% ethanol and only 40% sugar? That's less sugar that's available on the international market. That does have an effect on international sugar prices, and you could argue that Brazil and farmers, etc., can arbitrage with the world market as well, because Brazil is such a large producer. Brazil can have an impact on world prices. So I would just say that I think there is that competition for Brazil. Yes, Brazil doesn't have a shortage of food, but to the extent that it can have an impact on international prices, and not just for sugar, but also for other crops. If a larger percentage of soybeans, we've been doing the study on biodiesel production, if a larger percentage of production of soybeans goes to biodiesel production, then there's less of that would be exported. So there is that international trade perspective. And again, I think in the limit over the next few decades, Brazil is going to be absolutely critical as a food supplier. And perhaps as an ethanol supplier as well, but as a food supplier, and to that extent, it will have impacts on international food and markets. When we did some of the work when we started doing work on ethanol and looking at production of sugarcane and other crops, one of the reasons we did that was because everybody was saying, look at Brazil. Brazil can produce sugarcane, they can produce ethanol, they produce it efficiently, and we agree. They can produce it efficiently, they can produce it cost effectively. But then it was the extension. All countries can do this, or there are a large number of countries that can do that. And so what we were concerned with was that this model was going to be transferred to other countries. And again, there were certain interests that were very interested in extending Brazil's model to other countries, where we were very skeptical whether there was the potential. There may have been the land, and that's what a lot of the analysis was done on, with just availability of land, but you need to look at inputs and labor costs and availability of water and production costs. And again, nobody has production costs as low as Brazil. And that's one of the reasons why they were able to produce cost effectively, and still are, ethanol from sugar. So our perspective was, you need to look at your own situation in your own country to see whether you can produce this efficiently, and you also want to look at what are the impacts on land use in your country. And that was probably one of the reasons, because this was a global study, and that's probably one of the reasons why we were probably more cautious than I think our Brazilian colleagues would have wanted us to be. One of the other issues has to do with, and again, I think it's very important for your model, and I like the idea that you're looking at that, and that's one, the issue of alternative uses for the land. And one of the issues that has been that's certainly very important in Brazil is pasture. And when you're looking at cattle, in fact, one of the studies that the bank did about 2 years ago, I guess, and I think one of the conclusions was one of the main indicators of variables with deforestation is the price of beef. And as the price of beef went up, they had a direct correlation. And again, the process of this socially and economically are more complicated than I'm making it sound, but still, as a variable, the price of beef would go up. There was obviously more incentive to raise cattle, and some of that was going to other areas. Soybeans was replaced into further north, and some of the pasture land was then further into the Amazonas. So I think looking at the interaction of those, and it's not an easy job to do, but I think you really need to look at the displacement of other activities, including pasture, to look at what the overall impact will be on land use. And again, from a greenhouse gas perspective, a lot of it has to do with that land conversion, not just forests. I mean, forests is one of the issues, but just land conversion from any pasture, from any grasslands, etc. If you convert that land if you disturb that land or do plowing of that land, the carbon balance is going to change, and so a lot of the new work that's been done on agricultural emissions of greenhouse gases is really related to that land use change. Obviously, there's issues of the production and fertilizer and energy use, but the biggest variable for crop production and greenhouse gases is the land conversion issue, and not necessarily from forests. Certainly, forests, if you disturb the forests and the carbon in biomass, etc., roots and the soil as well is large, but you get carbon storage in all kinds of different types of lands. I think I'll leave it there. Anyway, conclusion. I think this type of work is very important, and Brazil is certainly the key actor in the global ethanol business, global sugar market, and from my perspective, future agricultural producer. I know I've worked in China for 15, 20 years, and I know the Chinese are drooling over Brazilian cropland, and I know they wish they had as much and as productive land as Brazil has.
Thank you, Todd. And now we'll have Barbara Bramble from the National Wildlife Federation with President Wilson Luque.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Your
Absolutely.
As they will see.
It's an honor to have him there and for me to be here. Thank you so much, Paolo. I'm going to make a few remarks that have to do with sort of where I stand. I work for the National Wildlife Federation. We obviously care about wildlife and habitat. We also, in a very major priority now for us is climate change, so that's mostly the reason for the work that I do on biofuels. I'm on the steering board of something called the Round Table for Sustainable Biofuels, and that's a process, a global process, on which I'm happy to say there are some members from Brazil that are participating in developing standards eventually for a certification system, we hope, that will allow market-based choices about more sustainable versus less sustainable production and use of biofuels. And in that process, I do think that Brazil has actually got a very good story to tell compared to many other places. And I think something that has been talked about a couple of times here is the very true basis for my remarks too, which is that we really are talking about land use and land use controls and unplanned or perhaps unwise changes in land use. And so the long-term, very, very long-term solution to all this is better understanding of how we should do land use management on a global basis, every country. And through the UN Climate Change Treaty, there are some mechanisms that I hope will lead to that long-term solution. But during the next 10 or 15 years, we need to deal with what's before us now and what's possible to do now, and that's more or less in the area that we're talking about here. So, just a couple of starting remarks. The food versus fuel controversy, as I have read it over the last year or so, has been quite unbalanced and actually quite wrong in many of the ways that Andre has described. There are many factors that are forcing up the price of different kinds of food crops. And in the long term, many of those are not even things we can deal with. We can't even really know where they're going, but I think they're all going in a very difficult direction. Increased population, increased numbers of people who will choose to have more meat in their diet, and of course that is their choice and they should have that choice. But droughts and all sorts of speculative activities. I mean, there's many different things that are happening to food prices, and biofuels as yet is a very small piece of that. All of this is going to be complicated by climate change, however, and if plans are to dramatically increase biofuels production, we actually have to be thinking about the trends and not just where we are now. So, while I believe that there are enormous increases in agricultural productivity on the horizon, there's been a history of this, and I don't see why it should disappear all of a sudden. I think all of those productivity increases are going to be needed to deal with the long-term trends of population growth, of changes in diet, and the challenges of climate change in a lot of regions of the world that are going to be hit with really bad impacts. So, from our perspective, adding an entire new land use, which is biofuels, is just adding to the competition over land, which already exists but will get worse. So here's my main point, and I'm begun to sound very boring on this to all my friends. The competition is not between food and fuel only. It's between food and fuel and fiber and natural habitat, wildlife conservation, carbon storage, watershed management, shopping centers, cities, and every other kind of land use there is. I mean, all land use is in competition with all other land use. And that's why this indirect land use problem is so important. It's almost impossible at this point to calculate. I do not disagree with Andre at all about how complicated and perhaps impossible it may be to assign sort of responsibility for it, but it exists and we have to deal with it. And this is one of the reasons why. Not in Brazil, it seems, but in most parts of the world, most land is already busy. It's doing something. It's either producing agricultural crops or not producing them very well, but it's somebody's livelihood, like grasses and reeds to make baskets. Certainly a lot of poor people are planting crops on areas that are called wastelands, and they're in the calculation by a lot of countries of available or wastes, or they are wilderness areas, or they're storing carbon, biodiversity, and water. And there's very little land that is actually sitting there doing nothing, waiting for somebody to find a new use for it. So some of those new uses, the shift in use, particularly from forests, but also, as Todd said, from grasslands, grasses with very deep-rooted species of grasses, converting that land to something like biofuels in many places will have a huge greenhouse gas impact. Now, this is not about Brazil and not about sugarcane, but certainly the Indonesia example in palm oil is one of the worst situations for this. Most of you know what I'm talking about. Brazil may be on the better end of that, and most of the rest of the world is somewhere in between. But just because we can't calculate it doesn't mean the effect isn't real. So, example would be Plantation A in Malaysia is producing palm oil. They've been doing it for years. It is used for food purposes, for margarine or something like that. Very little of it as yet is going into biofuels, biodiesel. Plantation A may be wonderfully sustainably managed, and so a company from my country goes over and says, I'd like to buy some of your palm oil and I want it to be labeled sustainable someday, and so I don't want it to come from a deforestation situation. And they say, fine, this is it, this is your stuff, and they come back with 100 million gallons of whatever it is. And that's very good, except that Plantation A no longer has what it used to sell to a company that makes margarine, and somebody in Indonesia or Malaysia will be induced to, by the prices, deforest an area in order to produce for this new market. And in most of the areas available that are really economically available in Indonesia, as far as I understand it, are forest areas with a consequence of 200 or so tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre, up to 500 such tons per hectare. And it's partly because there is a lot of degraded land in Indonesia, but it's quite expensive to use. And the deforestation is often a very good way to harvest timber that is a high-value crop that makes the entire project valuable. And without that first infusion of cash from the timber, you wouldn't have a viable plantation, because you have to wait years for production. So you're kind of stuck to figure out how would production maintain itself or increase if a whole new use is coming along and taking out of an existing market a very substantial amount for a biofuel product. For the first few years of this, I can imagine it's minor, it's modest, but if people are really thinking of gearing up by orders of magnitude, then it does become a serious effect. Now, here's a kicker. This is not really just because of biofuels, but of course all agriculture is expanding, as Andre was explaining. Well, biofuels are the new guy, so they're going to have to explain their use more than other people, and it's very unfortunate that Brazil's very efficient uses are getting all the blame, but obviously it's an effective agriculture. But biofuels are also getting hit with this because there's this claim that they are green fuels, and we really actually have to understand the facts about what makes a green fuel and incorporate the carbon dioxide impacts of these shifts when they happen to make sure that that claim is true. But that's exactly what the roundtable I'm working with is trying to do, and certainly the shift of pasture land to sugarcane, which is a grass and it grows for quite a long time on a specific piece of land and does its own sequestration of carbon in the roots. That's a very high value shift in the world of shifts, but that's not happening most places. So the studies that have caused all the recent controversy are out of, at least one of them is from Princeton, from a team of researchers who had an article in Science that started to try to characterize this indirect land use problem, the displaced deforestation or loss of pastures caused by basically the increase in need for land to grow fuels and food and all the other things. But this paper only begins to scratch the surface of the calculations that are going to need to be understood about this phenomenon before we can have a detailed ability to assign any kind of carbon responsibility to any specific area or any specific crop. But I think the phenomenon that it describes is a real one, and it does deserve serious consideration and further study. Complications are all over the place. Besides the different crops going in different directions that Andre talked about, is the fact that a lot of different feedstocks may be producing food and fuel at the same time. Soybeans, obvious example, so is corn. They have a protein product as well as an oil or an ethanol product. You cannot assign the total diversion of either of those to fuel as a direct removal from the food stream, but there is some diversion, and we cannot just ignore it. But overall, the basic point is, if good farmland that was once devoted to producing food is even now being partly devoted to energy production, then some of those original food uses must go somewhere. And that's to what? To available land. So then the question is, what's available, and is it really quite so available? And the study that Andre did, I think, is a real good start on understanding where is available land and under what conditions it might be usefully devoted to fuel use. I think Brazil's situation is a really interesting model, at least for those countries that produce a large amount of sugar, or used to, therefore have infrastructure and the ability to stay with that or increase its productivity, yields per acre. Yields per hectare, excuse me. So I think the sugarcane possibilities for the Caribbean nations, for example, is really quite important, and others who may have been in the sugar business, partly because overall, long term, with everybody going into, diet sodas and otherwise using artificial sugar, and you can imagine that sugar is not one of those products that necessarily needs to keep pace with the rise in population or in eating habits, but certainly palm oil does, and that's a really big problem. And Brazil is being mischaracterized, perhaps, or dumped into the same basket with the palm oil problem, which is real and more serious, perhaps more of an example of the direction we shouldn't be going. But unfortunately, it's all lumped into this phrase, biofuels. And that's why I'm hoping our standards will help to discriminate in the marketplace between the bad stuff and the good stuff. So just a couple of last comments. There are a couple of studies that are being kicked off just about now. The Department of Energy of the United States is funding one, the government of Germany and some EU money in Europe, to try to actually map and identify areas that might be considered available, perhaps degraded lands that would be really valuable to be restored to good productivity, and perhaps biofuels is one way to do that. But in the meantime, that study is going to take a while, but in the meantime, we really do have to be thinking about what are the most productive ways, besides Brazilian sugarcane, that others can be thinking about the biofuels business. And I am hoping that in the long term, you're going to have technologies for more advanced biodiesel feedstocks like algae, but that's pretty far away, cellulosic ethanol for certain kinds of woody crops that might be available in northern countries. There's going to be woody wastes from forest thinnings as long as they're harvested on a sustainable basis. But there are really a lot of actual wastes. And if we put our mind to it, it would seem to me that the waste products area is what biofuels really ought to be made of. There are food wastes. The French fry oil is famous, but there's not very much of that. But there's an awful lot of animal carcass wastes, of other municipal garbage wastes, the paper and pulp industry wastes, a whole array of sewage sludges and cow manures, and I mean there are enormous amounts of waste, but they're in the wrong place. Most of the research that's been done recently is not on how to use them, and some of them are temporary, or they come in small batches, but they move around. And so one of the more productive ways to think about future biofuel production in northern countries certainly would be to have small mobile units that can use orange peels when those are available, and nut casings when those are available, and avocado pits when those are available, and storm-related wastes when some next horrible storm like Katrina takes place. There's a mass of woody wastes there, but that they have no way to use it yet, but the cellulosic ethanol technology would make that available. But these are not plants that you can put in place and have a huge production forever. Once that group of materials is not available anymore, you would have to be able to move on. And certainly there's a need for thinking more broadly about energy. We have a fixation in this country now about biofuels, liquids for automobiles, whereas producing power through biomass and biogas eventually for electric cars and plug-in hybrids may be a much more sensible way to use this available material. Nevertheless, if we're thinking about biofuels, that's the subject of our day, I think it is certainly unfair the way Brazil has been sort of lumped in with all of the areas where biofuel production is so much more of a problem. But the Brazilian people and government need to understand why this happens. And it's mostly because Brazil is a very special case. It's not a situation that's replicable in most other countries. And the model may not be as exportable as is hoped. So we've got small mobile units that we should be looking at wastes. We've got medium term where we hope that we can look at sewage sludges and paper and pulp. But then we really need those people who think we're really going to get a very large amount of biofuels out of either crops or wastes. After Brazil ramps up fully, I don't think that is likely to be available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I wanted to open now for questions, and now I'll start with one. We hear that production of ethanol, sugarcane ethanol in Brazil could go up substantially using basically the same acreage by precisely developing ways of doing cellulosic ethanol from the biomass. If you just could update us on that, what is the state of that kind of research and what is the projected potential growth of ethanol from sugarcane using the whole material available?
Yeah, I'm not exactly an expert on the technical aspects of the cellulosics, but if we take now, for example, Brazilian sugarcane is producing around 7,000 liters of ethanol per hectare. If we use, for example, Indian sugarcane, we could get 5,500 liters per hectare, because Brazilian sugarcane has more sugar than Indian, for example. We can almost double the production per hectare with the cellulosic ethanol if we have the whole process controlled, right? But as I understand, if we go to, because we have the two types of cellulosic, so if we have to the first step, we could go to 12,000 liters, and potentially we could go to 14,000 liters. So we could almost double the production per hectare using the bagasse, the sugarcane bagasse, to produce ethanol, and using the sugarcane leaves and straws to produce ethanol also. So it's this is very important because it's simple. I think it's clear that we don't need to expand sugarcane production, sugarcane area to produce much more ethanol, and of course we are using the sugarcane in a more efficient way because we are using leaves and straws also, and leaves and straws in Brazil are burned. Of course, we are banning the burning process, the burning harvesting, but anyway, we still burn sugarcane in Brazil.
Could I add one thing to that? There is, however, a trade-off. Everything here we're talking about has a trade-off. The bagasse, and I think in some places the leaves and straw, which aren't burned in the field, are burned in the plant to produce the power for the ethanol production. So if you can't do that because you've turned it into ethanol, then you will still have to get the power from somewhere. So it isn't exactly as much of an increase overall as one might hope. So there's still no free lunch.
Yeah, it's a little, but it's actually halfway through both of these points, because what you have in the case of today in electricity, for you need the mic.
Is that a microphone?
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, you can move that.
Projection.
Yeah, we need 3 here.
That's okay. I think what I mean, and right now, you can divide the sugarcane in 3 parts, right? You can divide it into just the stalk with the juice in it, the stalk dried out without the juice, and the foliage. The foliage today in conventional harvesting around the world is burnt. About 50% of Sao Paulo's production is already mechanized, so you bring an extra biomass to the mill that is being burned. The choice is, and back to Paulo's question, is whether you convert that biomass to through cellulosic to more ethanol. There's a tremendous cost involved in that. Technology is available, but the price per liter or per gallon of the ethanol will be very high. Or do you burn additional biomass, as Barbara is suggesting, but in this case to produce even higher surplus of electricity? The mill is self-sufficient just with the cane stalk in terms of electricity for powering its own, to be self-sufficient. So the decision, Paulo, is going to be for the mill perspective, it's a business, what makes more money? Does he make more money converting that biomass into through cellulosic processes into cellulosic ethanol, or does he make more money burning it to make electricity? Now, at the end of the day, back to Barbara's objective here to give, we have to decide which one is better from an environmental standpoint and give the policymaker the tools to make that decision. We think in the short term, the realistic one is to harvest this biomass through mechanized processes, take it to the mill, produce electricity, because even if you say, well, you're burning biomass to produce electricity, Brazil, the marginal increases of electricity on the grid aren't going to come from easy hydros, as I like to say, that we had in Brazil for electricity. They're either going to come from imported LNG, heavy fuel oil, or putting large hydros in the middle of the Amazon. So, you take your pick which one you want to do.
Well, we are open for questions. Who will go first? No.
Oh, thanks. Andre, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. But I'm curious. I'm glad you left that table up there, and it sort of goes back to something I think Barbara was saying, and I know this wasn't your purpose, but looking at the whole set of competing land uses I think is important. In China, for example, cities basically are major competing land use, and because so much of the area also is very poor from an agricultural production standpoint, like India, which you mentioned. But I'm just curious, São Paulo, about twice as much pasture land was displaced than new crop production, either for sugarcane, which was the bulk of it, for other things. And that raises 2 questions. One, what happened to the other 700,000 million, whatever, hectares that are not there? It must have gone to something. And secondly, where did all that pasture land go? Some of it probably went to Mato Grosso, but I think it does raise the issue of the whole set of interacting forces that, including both increases in domestic demand, but particularly in the case of Brazil, external demand. Beef prices, soy prices, eventually ethanol prices, rice prices, all sorts of things. And given that Brazil is in such a privileged position in terms of its supply capacity, clearly it's going to both benefit and suffer some of the effects from this likely very strong increase in the future in demand for all of these different commodities. But it does raise some interesting questions as to, it's a very, very dramatic sort of change in land use over the last 4 years in a number of states, but particularly in São Paulo. And I just wondered whether someone is sort of looking at this whole picture, where you're not necessarily your group, but others in University in São Paulo or elsewhere, sort of looking at the whole set of changes in land use for agricultural, including ranching activities, and what the implications are. Todd mentioned a study that we did at the World Bank some years ago, looking at current causes of deforestation in the Amazon. And the main direct factor did seem to be expansion of ranching activities, very much in response to external demand, incorporating real improvements in technology. And I was also intrigued by your one of the first things you said about the fact that pasture land overall is not increasing, yet I think demand for beef in Brazil is increasing. I think I saw the other day that Brazil is now the largest exporter of beef in the world, and presumably that will continue to rise. Clearly, this does become an incentive for more intensive cattle ranching and more productive beef production more generally. But it also has likely continued to add pressures on land. And clearly, with so much land being now dedicated to sugarcane production in places like São Paulo, Minas Gerais, soy production in places like Mato Grosso, the Cerrado in general, there will be continuing over the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think, pressures that need to be considered in all of this. But again, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I was not sure if I should have showed that table, but anyway, I think it's more interesting to discuss than to hidden, right? Okay, one thing that explains this stronger reduction in pasture than the expansion in sugar and crops is that I'm not included in this table the oh my God, is we have annual temporary crops and crops like coffee or fruits and yeah, how we call this in
Semi-permanent.
yeah,
perennial.
Yeah, perennial crops, something like that, right? So this is if I include this, if I would include that, I could explain. I could show other agricultural activities that are using pasture land. That's one thing, but of course will not offset all the difference, right? One thing that let me see how I will explain that. I think it's almost impossible to discuss that there is no indirect effect. There are some indirect effects, right? The question is if biofuels are contributing to that. That's the argument of Barbara. But for me, I think this indirect effect is true even without biofuel, right? Because changing is moving. Crops are moving in Brazil, right? Are moving. So even if we don't have the demand of biofuel, the excess of demand due to biofuel, we could have the problem of the indirect effects. The question is that people would not be concerned about this. If we were, displacing Cerrado for food, people would say, okay, it's for food, no problem. But given that we have sugarcane expanding also, so then we have the question of the green fuel. It is green or not? That's the question. So measuring the carbon cycle is a way to prove or not if it is green or not, right? What is interesting, let me see if I can follow all your questions. Sugarcane, because I've been through all these numbers, and one thing that is important is, let me see, I'm trying to find an example to explain to you, because in the case of São Paulo we have sugarcane expanded, crops expanded, and pasture. Okay, the question of pasture, right, all right. If you take a look on the number of pasture. Yeah, no, it's not here. It's here. You see that this region that I define, we have 75 million hectares on pasture, right? Out of 172 in Brazil, right? So you can see that 100 million hectares of pasture are out of this region that I defined. This has to do with your question. So it is clear that we have cattle moving to the Amazon. This is clear. It's impossible to deny that. I don't have the numbers here, but if I show to you the numbers, you will see that we have around 40% of our cattle herd in the Amazon region. So 40% of the cattle herd in the Amazon region is very important, right? The question is that on cattle in the Amazon, we have the similar situation that Barbara mentioned to Indonesia. We have the exploration of timber financing, right? The deforestation, and after that they put cattle there. What we are trying to do, and it's been very difficult to do, is to separate expansion of cattle due to economic effects like prices and demand, and expansion of cattle due to the deforestation. And it's quite difficult to separate that in the Amazon. The way that I'm trying to do this is classifying Amazon in suitable or not suitable for agriculture. Because we could expect that if cattle is expanding in no suitable land, right? So there is no economic reason for that, because why would you put cattle in an area that you will not be able to sell for a soybean or for a corn, or even if we can develop a sugarcane that will grow well, that will have a lot of sugar in the Amazon for a sugarcane producer, right? So it's quite difficult to separate that. That's my biggest problem now, is to understand the expansion of cattle in the Amazon region, because part are expanding due to the timber, to logging and everything, and part is expanding due to economic effects, demand, exports, right? But what is important to see is that our cattle herd, okay, and in São Paulo, of course, we don't have the cattle herd numbers here, right? But if I have included here, you would see that cattle herd in São Paulo decreased, right? So São Paulo is producing less meat that São Paulo used to produce it in the past. So it is clear that this meat is being compensated in other, right? But what is interesting that you cannot say that sugarcane is doing that. It's a normal process of the cattle production. Cattle has to go to a low-value land. That's the way extensive grass-fed cattle has to run away from the expensive land, because it's impossible to produce grass-fed cattle in expensive land, right? So that's another thing. We have more and more feedlots in São Paulo, in Minas Gerais, in Paraná is not important, but because Paraná is a perfect offset. If you sum this with this, you will get this. It's perfect. I would love to find that in São Paulo, but anyway, I couldn't.
You have a question?
Yeah, sorry.
Which brings me to that. What's the effect of sugarcane production on the price of land in the Cerrado? Because what it seems, if we say it's pasture is being liberated by this cyclical decrease in the amount of land needed for pasture, what's going to happen when all that land, eventually that cycle will come full circle and there'll be a real pressure to expand pasture needs. So how's that playing out?
Yeah, okay, so pasture is not releasing land by the normal cycle of cattle yet. That's what I think that will happen in the future, due to the fact that our number of cows and calves is very tight in terms of supplying new animals to be killed and to produce more meat, right? So cattle herd always increased in Brazil. Now it will stabilize, right? That's a new trend in Brazil, right? So people from beef sector, they wouldn't like to hear what I'm saying here, because they would say, okay, Brazil will not have excess of surplus of meat in the next year. That's true.
So
we will not be able to double or to.
Why will it stabilize if external demand is increasing?
Because that's a reproduction rate. You cannot make a cow give to you 2 calves per year.
So in the
You
very short term,
very
short term, the number of cattle is limited.
No, it's not a very short. It's 5 to 7 years. If we continue to kill, I will come back to your question on the price of land. I will come back to you. I didn't forget.
Butchering now
Yeah.
because of the prices. So
No,
that
the
will-
question is,
Você está matando muita vaca.
for example, if you have your slaughter rate cannot be higher than 25%, which is you can kill only 25% of your cattle herd per year. If you kill more than that, your cattle herd will start to go down, and then your meat production will go down. That's the idea. We are in the bottom. We are in the top. We are in the 25% now in Brazil, right? Cows, if reproduction rate, a normal reproduction rate is 70%. So if you have 100 cows, only 7 will reproduce per year, because you need 9 months and some months milking the animal. So it's impossible to go beyond than that. There is no technology to go beyond than that. That's the problem. When you put all this calculation, you can see that cattle herd in Brazil will need more than 5 years to start to increase again.
But that's not very long.
Right? No, it's not very long, but
My point only is if the prices stay high, there will be an incentive to produce more. Now there may be a lag,
As soon as possible.
that's right. But cattle price and calves price will be so high in Brazil that there will be no incentive for feedlots to buy them. Also, because they will lose money, margins will disappear. So this is something that is balanced. Prices in world price will be higher, but cows and calves prices will hold the Brazilian capacity to produce more, right? Because this has to be balanced. Okay, we can discuss that later. Regarding your question on price of land, that is true. Price of land in Cerrados, in Mato Grosso do Sul is going up, right? So is going up and will keep going up. That's the question. So if you go to Mato Grosso, you see the number. You see many projects of feedlots being built there. Why they are building feedlots there? Because you find corn and soybean in Mato Grosso, which is feed, right? And land is too expensive, so it's the best alternative. The opportunity cost of land lead the farmer to use the land for sugar, or for corn, or for soybean, right? And concentrating animals in feedlots. The question is that you need to originate the animal to finish in the feedlot, right? That comes to your question, from where you will get the animals, right? So part will come from the north. It's clear, from the areas that already have been deforested, and you find pasture there.
The cattle is getting pushed or pulled is the question.
Yes.
It's being pulled
It's
by
an,
the low
yeah. So it's something that is happening.
By the high prices.
That's being pushed by the increasing land prices.
Yeah, but it's being pulled to the lowest price available.
Exactly. But where does it
Yeah.
go?
But
That's
it's
where it
not
goes.
being pushed.
Yeah.
My question is, it being
Not
pushed by the
pushed
crop?
By the crops. That's your question, right?
Is what's pulling it stronger than what's pushing it? And I think what you're suggesting is the price of land is so much cheaper up north that it's pulling more than the crop is pushing it out.
Yes, it's a simultaneous process, and you need to take account the timberland also, right?
I'd like to just add one more thing into this discussion, because it really is very important and interesting. The scale of production, we need to think of it as sort of, where is this trying to go? Because I don't think it's reasonable to worry that 3 million hectares or 4 million hectares is having an enormous impact on the scale of production of the different commodities and beef and the other things that Brazil is a major world force in producing. However, if one is planning this whole area of biofuels for very large new production in future with a goal, then it does matter a great deal, and we need to be thinking about where is all of this going. Time, in other words, is the production heading for times 10 or times 20 where it is now? And here is just a point that keeps me thinking about the importance of that for real. It's not a just an imaginary thing. When Brazil and the United States were producing about the same amount of ethanol, which was a couple of years ago, United States from corn, Brazil from sugarcane, obviously very much more productive per hectare in Brazil. But the amount, if we just look at the quantity, which at that time was about 4-point-something billion gallons of ethanol. In Brazil, that was a very important and respectable 40-some% of the gasoline usage in the country, and it's something to be very proud of for national autosufficiency. But that same amount in the United States was very little more than 2% of the gasoline used here. Now we've gone up some production, we import some indirectly from Brazil, we're doing various things, and we may have gotten up to 6 or 7%.
It will be 7
this year in the United States, but that's with all of this perturbation of world corn prices. So somebody thinks we can go up to 36 billion gallons of ethanol production in the United States over a
15 would be from corn, so to be fair, that may be close.
More than double from corn, and then the rest of it expecting the new technologies and expecting some more imports from Brazil. I hope everybody is aware that that is part of the private calculus. It's not being very public. But cellulosic ethanol, obviously, if that's not online, that 36 billion is impossible to reach. But nevertheless, these are major perturbations in the agriculture sort of established understanding of quantities and scales and use of land, and yet fairly minor perturbations, unfortunately, in the actual need of the substitution of gasoline-type energy, liquid fuels. And so we have this disconnect in terms of the effect on land, which is huge, for a fairly minor benefit to, if you count it as a benefit, to the fuel mix. And so what worries me is the thought that somebody is really serious about going up times 10 or something to get toward this 140 billion gallons a year of gasoline type things that the U.S. uses. That's just not realistic, which is what it isn't realistic without major perturbations. So that leads me to say, let's be modest. Let's think about what can be produced by countries with a real comparative advantage. Brazil is right up there, probably the highest than anyone, and nevertheless not expect that it's actually somehow going to magically substitute for all the gasoline usage in the United States, which is at this point it's a black hole. It just can't be filled.
Good, yeah.
When Barbara mentioned possibly higher import by the U.S. of Brazilian ethanol, I kept thinking about the current political debate. Working now at Congress, I also saw many speeches which were not conflicting food and biofuels or food and fuels, but the Amazon and fuels and ethanol. So I think that this political debate now, at least from what I've seen in the Congress recently, is really going the wrong direction. I'm not sure if it's because of misinformation or because of some hidden interests coming from certain sectors of the economy, the oil sector or food sector. But anyway, senators bringing up this issue of ethanol taking up the Amazon, and even this group last week of scientists, including one of those who wrote this article from Princeton University, and this was supposed to talk about ethanol in worldwide terms, but they concentrated on corn-based ethanol, and you know, you could ask around, and many people wouldn't know that ethanol is also made from sugar cane in this country. So I think my question would be, what can you do to educate better people around in the U.S.? Well, I have a fellow in my office, a young lady who studied environmental journalism here in the state of Washington. She didn't know about sugarcane. And the politicians themselves, because even if the scientists are not presenting the case of sugarcane, how come the politicians would do this by themselves?
Yeah, well, in order to keep the current scheme of subsidies, people would probably go as far as helping Brazil saving the Amazon. You know, that's very generous.
I think the Amazon
right?
is more sexy than
Yes.
food.
In this country, it is. In Europe, it's a very different story. As you probably know, the food versus fuel controversy is the critical issue of the moment on biofuels in Europe. Here, people don't seem to even follow that, but it isn't a hidden agenda, I don't think. It's quite a overt agenda, which has to do with corn business and local United States sugar business. And both of those are going to come up against real numbers, which make it impossible for whatever is in the recent energy law to actually be produced from here. And so what I was saying about how the assumptions of those who know what they're talking about is that Brazilian sugar cane will be part of the equation, are those who've looked at the numbers, understand what is feasible for production of corn and sugar in the United States, and they have defined advanced biofuels to include sugarcane ethanol. So once you get to the grandfathered, the new ethanol plants for making in the United States from corn, you run out of that about 13 billion gallons, and there's an expectation of having 15 or so billion from sort of what you might call first generation pre-cellulosic. They have a big window, several billion gallons, that's between those two, and that has to be taken up by sugar. It's not possible to get it from anything else. But publicly they won't say it right now because of everything that you mentioned, and it's really too bad. It's just very unfortunate.
Well, in public, this is all we can say right now because our webcast is running out. I just wanted to thank Andrea very much for this study, to Todd and Barbara. I think it would be fair to expect that other organizations make similar efforts to do land use studies in various important countries and see how this is done. I think this shows that there is a very important quality to this, an effort in this debate to present reality based on facts. And again, Andrea, thank you very much. This is what we are here for at the Brazil Institute, and I want